Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. Now, fair warning, this video is going to cover a topic that is very complicated and highly controversial. We're going to try, it's a super complicated topic, but we're going to try to address it briefly. It's still going to be a long video, but trust me, it's nowhere near as long as it could be. But it is a highly controversial topic, and that is Shinto really its own religion? Or is it a later offshoot of Japanese Buddhism? Now, I know a lot of you watching this video are probably very confused by that question because most people, Japanese and foreigner, instantly believe that they know the truth. And for them, the truth is that Shinto is its own independent religion. However, that's actually not true. Or rather, this point is heavily debated among two factions of scholars / believers. What we're going to do is we're going to examine this question as simply as possible. We're going to start by looking at the debate and the implications of the dynamic, and then we'll talk about its relationship to Tada Genji, etc., etc. But this is one of those things where everybody believes that they know the obvious truth, but the obvious truth is actually not what everyone believes. So let's start by addressing the two main modern day factions and their basic stances, and then we'll dive further into the analysis. So the first stance is that Shinto is the original native religion of Japan. This is put forward by scholars such as Hirai and Kitagawa. This is the thing that most people believe is true, but this is actually just an opinion of this faction. That is, the idea that Shinto is a fully formed independent religion prior to Buddhism and that it has been there the entire time, right? You hear this all the time. People say, oh, Shinto and Buddhism get together and they got along, or Shinto is this and Buddhism is this, etc., etc. But this is only an opinion. Now, granted, it is the predominant opinion. It is the one that we all have to work off of because currently this is the one that has the government support, right? This is the popular opinion. But it is only an opinion. The other faction has really good evidence for the idea that Shinto is an offshoot of Buddhism and Taoism. This is led by certain scholars. A gentleman named Kuroda is sort of one of the lead scholars of this opinion. In this opinion, Shinto is actually just Taoism with some native beliefs and political ritual some native beliefs, some political ritual, Taoism, and it's an amorphous sort of entity that is not freestanding, and that it is amalgamated into Buddhism, and it is only later that it becomes its own independent identity. Now, for the first view, which is the popular view, which is the view that just everybody just knows is true, right? Shinto is a religion. It's the native Japanese religion. But there's really not that much evidence for that belief, other than the assumption that it's true. And most of the arguments are retrospective arguments, meaning they start at the end and work their way and look backwards into history. And retrospective analysis is highly controversial because, confirmation bias, there's all kinds of problems that pop up when you start at the end and then look for evidence backwards through history. And it's just highly problematic. And furthermore, it doesn't really have a whole lot of good, strong responses to attacks or challenges made by the second opinion. The second opinion, or the second view, the view that Shinto never existed until much later, that view, it has a lot of strong evidence. And it does not rely on retrospective analysis. Rather, it actually starts at the beginning and works its way through time forward. And it holds up very well to most of the challenges and attacks from the first opinion. And like I said, many of its challenges toward the first opinion go unchallenged. So because the first opinion is the prevailing view among most Japanese and foreigners, and because it relies on retrospective analysis, which is highly problematic, and it relies on belief and not much else, we will not be addressing it in this video, because you can Google this. This is the common view. You can just Google everything you need to know about this common view of Shinto. There's no reason for us to go into it. This video is actually going to focus on the second view, the view that Shinto is actually a Taoist-based offshoot of Buddhism. This is the view that we will be looking at in the video. This is also the view of the Tada Genji tradition. This idea that so in the Tada Genji tradition, Shinto is not its own independent entity. The only time that Shinto becomes its own independent entity within the Tada Genji tradition is only when you look at the works of certain individuals like Tada Yoshitoshi in the 1700s. I mentioned him in a previous video. He is part of that Mito domain nativist Shinto efforts of the 1700s to make a Shinto that has nothing to do with Buddhism. So in his writings, you will see Tada Genji teachings sort of stripped of the Buddhism, and it's just the Shinto parts, quote unquote the Shinto parts. But other than that, in all the prior to his works of the 1700s, the Tada Genji tradition teaches that Shinto, what we call Shinto, is an aspect of Buddhism. So like I said in a previous video, I discussed how the Mito domain scholars killed a document called the Kujiki in order to cause this what they called the revitalization of Shinto. And of course, that is using the concepts of the first view. See, the nativist scholars of this time period, these Mito domain scholars, these nativist scholars, they believed that there was some religion there. But they had to do a bunch of work in order to sort of find this religion. So they had to, they had to ban the Kujiki for one thing. In other words, they had to just get that document gone because they couldn't get around that. So they just got it banned, etc. We'll talk about that some more later. But from the second view, the view that's in line with the Tada Genji belief, this view says that those scholars of the 1700s, and you can call them the Mito domain scholars, or you call them Fuko scholars or Kokugaku scholars. There's different terms for these nativist scholars. But they wanted to disempower the Yoshida style Shinto because that would truly allow them to begin the process of trying to strip Buddhism away, strip Taoism away, try to find something that they could call Shinto, something that they would believe it was an independent religion. But the problem is they had to do an immense amount of work, an immense amount of retconning in order to sort of make this work. So their efforts actually evidence that they could not readily find a quote unquote Shinto, and that they had to go through great efforts to build one. That actually supports the second opinion. So let's take a break from that for a second, and let's just address some questions directly. And the first one is, people will ask, isn't Shinto documented in the Nihon Shoki? And in these old documents, doesn't it say the word Shinto? And it does say the word Shinto, but not as a proper name of something. It is a passive noun. It's not the name of something, it's just a descriptor, the way of the gods. And in fact, the fact that it uses the way of the gods also gives away its Shinto, it gives away its Taoist nature. So, and also we should note that the term Shinto, way of the gods, also can be used to refer to Taoism itself. So even when it says way of the gods, you could argue that it's a reference to Taoism. This is a reasonable debate. But furthermore, the sparse usage of way of the gods in old text and references, it actually even more further proves that there isn't a definitive religion. In other words, you have this Taoist term, way of the gods. It's sparse, hardly ever appears. That means that there's not a religion there named Shinto. And then, if you want to be a person of the first opinion or somebody who's like looking backwards in history, which is incorrect, that's problematic. But say you want to be that person and you want to look backwards through history, you're going to ask a question like, well, what about the Shinto that exists through the whole of Japanese history? Now, the problem with that question is you already start with the false assumption that there is a Shinto that exists throughout all of history. Again, that's a false assumption. And that's exactly what I'm trying to explain to you. There is not a Shinto that appears throughout history. There are a collection of practices related to government ceremonies, clan rituals, government rituals, but all of these ceremonies are basically or effectively they're Taoist rituals. And there are also lots of folk beliefs. Yes, there's a generic collection of folk beliefs, generic collection of clan histories, aka family histories. But, and there's shrines, but those shrines are really inseparable from these Taoist rituals, and they're absolutely overseen and influenced by Buddhist monks and Buddhism in general. And they have and a lot of the shrines are based on Taoist designs and first, in other words, the point being that if you were going to say that there's a Shinto that exists through history, you would have to be able to point to an independent entity named Shinto that is its own independent religion, self-characterized religion, that appears in history prior to Taoism and prior to Buddhism and can be tracked independently of those of Taoism and Buddhism. And the truth is, you simply cannot find that entity. Therefore, there is no independent Shinto existing through the historical record. So at some time in the ancient past, yes, there was surely a native religion of Japan that was free of Taoism and free of Buddhism, free of Chinese influence, free of Korean influence, the sort of indigenous, native, aboriginal religion of Japan. But that religion is long gone early on. Ancient Japan, that we think of ancient Japan like Emperor Jimmu, slightly before Emperor Jimmu, etc., the sort of like the beginnings of the imperial court forming and spreading across Japan at that time period. Japan was already heavily influenced by China and Korea with imported ideas and imported families. Once those families and those ideas were spreading, that original native religion is long gone. So what I'm saying is the religion that was around during the beginnings of the Yamato state, aka Japan as an empire spreading across the islands, the religion of that time period is a blend of Japanese customs and Chinese customs. And it's very clearly Taoist. And as I said, for a long time, whenever Shinto appeared in documents, it was only a passive, loose reference to the way of the gods, which is a Taoist term. Shinto's focus on nature, mirrors, swords, sacred steps, water purification rites, all of these things is very Taoist. If any of the viewers have studied Taoism and you study you study actual Shinto, like serious Shinto, you will see that it's very, very much the same thing. When I say the obsession with mirrors and the obsession with swords facing one way or facing another way and all of these things, there's no way that it is impossible to comprehend this as being not Taoist. And yes, there are some aspects of pre-Chinese native Japanese religion more than likely lingering on in the traditions. More than likely, sure. But the Shinto, quote unquote, of earlier Japan, like I said, is clearly Chinese-ified. It's clearly Taoist heavy. Even to the point where the the Shinto belief, quote unquote Shinto belief, is that the universe started as an egg-shaped mass that's separated between yin and yang. That is exactly the Taoist religion, the Taoist belief. So, I mean, right from the very beginning, the way the world begins in quote unquote Shinto is exactly the way the world begins in Taoism. It's clearly taken from Taoism. All right, so let's move on to a question you might ask. Well, the belief system may not have been Aboriginal Japanese, but rather a Japanified Chinese belief system. But doesn't that still count as its own religion prior to Buddhism? And the answer to that is no. Because let's look at this just for a second. The Chinese-ified Japanese, the Japanified Chinese beliefs and the Taoism, it's so strong within the beliefs that you would have grounds to just simply call it Japanified Taoism. This would not give you Shinto. This would just give you Japanified Taoism. Second of all, and this is the real important one, there's no cohesive organization to these beliefs. In fact, the beliefs are so spread out, mainly because most of it is government ritual, which is obviously Chinese and Taoist, right? Government ritual, and then the rest of it is mostly just histories of the families, histories of the clans, some clan rituals, family rituals, but a lot of these rituals trace back to China, trace back to Korea. So again, you have a lot of Chinese rituals and a lot of Korean rituals. It's very much just an amalgamation of Chinese and Korean inspired rituals sort of taking form, loosely taking form in relation to the politics and power struggle of the families at the time. There's no cohesive organization at all. So again, to really bring this point home, if you arrive at the point of there were a lot of disconnected traditions that were a combination of Taoism and local beliefs. Lots of quote unquote native Japanese groups were mixing with groups immigrating from China and Korea. And they were creating something that was amalgamating new amalgamation, some kind of Japanese Taoism, Chinese-ified native concepts. And these things were loosely amalgamating at this time period. There was no unified religion, just a vast assortment of these amalgamating ideas. Honestly, this is the very reason why documents like Nihon Shoki, Kojiki, Kujiki were written, and why they contain so many variations of events and stories. There were so many different beliefs and ideas that even contradicted each other that the court gathered all of these people together, and said, hey, we need to sort of like remember our history, and we need to try to sort this vast amalgamation of stuff that we're remembering. We need to sort of like give it some sense of history, some sense of structure. But even the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki, and the Kujiki, when they're written, they're not written as Shinto documents. At no point are they Shinto documents. They're just written as like the histories of the country, an attempt to try to capture some record of this amorphous collection of beliefs and ideas from the time period. Thus, there's no religion of Shinto to be found at the time period. There's just a collection of Taoism and this amalgamation of native Japanese and Chinese beliefs. And there's no self-identity. There's no independent, self-characterized identity of an independent religion. There's no religion here. There's just a collection. Now, and it is this amorphous mass that is brought under Buddhism's banner when Buddhism comes into the country. Buddhism had its own independent, distinct identity. Taoism has its own distinct, independent identity. But there is no distinct Shinto, right? There's just this amorphous amalgamation of Taoist and native beliefs, right? So, this causes two distinct events. So the first event is that after Buddhism comes to Japan and after Buddhism takes the amalgamation under its banner. Then and only then did scholars get together later to try to formulate some kind of history of Japan, like the Nihon Shoki, for example, and record ancient customs and ancient histories and genealogies and political things, etc., etc., etc. But in those records, it's very clear the Taoism and the heavy Chinese influence. So that's critically important to understand, because again, this all happens after the amalgamation is taken under the banner. Prior to that, none of that exists. The second distinct event is that by that time, by the time of the first event, the belief, the idea that Buddhism is the original root religion and that local gods and local customs are not seen as an independent religion, but they're seen as a branch or a projection or a display, an aspect of Buddhism. So the existence of these two specific events speaks heavily to the second opinion, to the second viewpoint, or to the viewpoint that Shinto is not its own entity. So what is unmistakable is the fact that by the time anyone thought to consider the nature and the history of the amorphous cloud of Japanified Chinese customs and beliefs that existed when Buddhism came to Japan, by the time anyone thought to consider that, Buddhism had already been in the country for generations, like generations had passed, before anybody decided, hey, let's actually look at this as something other than just, what we've been looking at it for like the last 200 years. So, and even when these scholars begin to do this, they had to retrospectively work to build an understanding of a potential understanding of pre-Buddhist ideas. But even then, they didn't try to formulate it into its own independent religion. And furthermore, the entire reason that they were looking back was really for the purpose of government and government ritual and government ceremony. So the idea was still there that Buddhism is the root religion, and then there would be these government and local ceremonies would be like the flowers, right? So the root would be Buddhism, and then these rituals would be the flowers. There is this understanding that there's not a belief that there's Shinto and Buddhism. There's just Buddhism, and then Buddhism within it has sort of collected this amorphous collection, which then they're now going to write Nihon Shoki, write Kojiki, etc. They're going to write documents, and they're going to try to formulate it into a government reform and create formal, and make sure that these ceremonies are done. But the ceremonies are not done because they're Shinto or because they're any particular religion. It's just these are the ceremonies that need to be done at this time. There's a big difference between this is a government ritual versus this is an independent religion. It's two very different things. And this is where you get into the fundamental viewpoint of the many types of Shinto. And I put types of Shinto in quotations because, again, we're not looking at people conceiving of the religion as an independent entity of Shinto and then having different styles of Shinto. It's really just different traditions of ritual. Nobody's really viewing it as an independent religion. They're just viewing it as different types of rites, different types of rituals. This is where you get like Mononobe style Shinto or Taishi Shinto or Miwa style Shinto. They're related to particular families, the way particular groups of people do these rites, not branches of a religion. And almost all of these quote-unquote types of Shinto, they don't see Buddhism as something different from these rites, or they don't see it as two distinct religions. They really just see it as, if anything, a branch of Buddhism or sort of an aspect of Buddhism. So the Tada Genji tradition, again, leans heavily into this belief. and that is that Buddhism is the root religion, and this thing that we now call Shinto is a manifestation of Buddhism. That is, the kami are projections of the Buddhas. But, to be fair, let's look at some of the quote-unquote Shinto groups that break away from this ideology, and I would argue are the beginnings of the idea that Shinto is its own thing. So let's go back to the beginning, because we need to start from the beginning and work forward. Retrospective analysis is flawed. Start from the beginning and work forward. In the very beginning, when Buddhism is coming to the country, the Mononobe family opposed Buddhism. And this is often misquoted as the Mononobe supported Shinto against Buddhism. This is not actually what happened, though. That's incorrect. That's revisionist history, or that's let's looking backwards kind of take. There was no established Shinto religion. There was only this amorphous Taoist-based collection of rituals. What the Mononobe family was concerned about was that Buddhism would swallow up these Taoist-based rituals. And the reason that they were concerned about that, now read this in red because this is important, so pay attention. The Taoist-based rituals that the Mononobe were afraid of losing were the rituals tied to political power structures, because these rituals are heavily tied to clan politics. And by clan I mean bloodline, families, houses, the house politics, the bloodline politics. The Mononobe were afraid of losing political power. They weren't afraid of their religion being usurped by Buddhism, because there wasn't a religion, there wasn't a Shinto. They were afraid of their power rituals being swallowed up by Buddhism, and if their power rituals are displaced, then that is a political issue. It's not really a spiritual issue. It's a political issue. Now, ironically, you've heard me talk about Mononobe style Shinto and Mononobe, quote unquote Mononobe style Shinto, being Buddhist, right? But the Mononobe were opposed to Buddhism. So how does that happen? Well, the reason is because the Mononobe style of Shinto and the Shotoku style of Shinto are both Buddhist based, but they contain a lot of the family history and rituals and rites that come from the Mononobe family, which is why it's called Mononobe style Shinto, even though it technically believes in Buddhism and the Mononobe didn't. But it's Buddhism that retained their rituals and their rites, and that's why it's called Mononobe style. So with the defeat of the Mononobe, there isn't any real significant challenge to Buddhism being the religion and the rituals and rites of the government and of the clans just being an amorphous amalgamation that's contained under the banner of Buddhism. Okay, even when they begin to create the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki, etc., 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 nobody has this belief or idea or attempt of these things being an independent religion from Buddhism. It's just not there. The next time in history when we really see this begin, this idea of making a religion separate from this really starts to seed when the Issei shrines begin to develop what's called Issei style Shinto. Now, Issei style Shinto, now again in red, read, pay attention. When I say developed, develop means that it did not exist for a long time, and it had to come about at a later time. So it was not there in the beginning. It developed over time, and that's a critical piece of data that you have to include in the analysis. So the Issei style Shinto would eventually develop a paradigm switch, and this is kind of like the first step in Shinto becoming an independent entity. This form of Issei style Shinto begin to say that the kami was the root religion and that Buddhism was the expression. So whereas everyone else was saying that Buddhism is the root and the kami and the rituals of the kami is the expression, the flowers, the projection, Issei style Shinto started saying that the gods and the rituals of the gods was the real religion, and Buddhism was sort of a projection of the gods and the way of the gods, the rituals of the gods. But the simple fact that this concept of reverse had to take hundreds of years to develop and appear is proof that it did not previously exist, and that everyone was on board with Buddhism as the root until that point. You can't get around this. This is a point that is historically locked in. This can't be argued. If Shinto had been an independent, self-existing religion from the beginning, this wouldn't have took hundreds of years to show up. Now, Issei style Shinto does have two parts. It has a part related to the inner shrine and a part related to the outer shrine. And the outer shrine part is based on the Watari family. And if you remember from a previous video, I mentioned it, the Watari are the guys who edited the Kujiki. So creating an unfortunate issue where pretty much every copy of the Kujiki had passed through the Watari hands at some point. So finding a version that wasn't edited by them becomes problematic. And so it is from the Watari family teachings, or this Watari Shinto, this Watari branch of the Issei shrine, this where the Yoshida style Shinto comes from. And so because the Watari had such an influence with the Kujiki, this is why the Kujiki is a major part of Yoshida style Shinto. This was discussed in a previous video. So, but it is the Yoshida style of Shinto coming from this Issei style of Shinto that basically continues to develop this idea that the kami are the root and that Buddhism is the flower. But it takes a slightly different approach than the Issei style. And it is here at the beginnings of the Yoshida style Shinto, here is where, and I put this in red, this is where for the first time you start to see Shinto as a self-characterized identity. But it's still holding on to Buddhism. But this is the only place where you really, so the Issei style Shinto begins to conceive of them as two different things and sort of reverse the paradigm, and then the Yoshida style Shinto takes that and develops it further, but Buddhism is still contained. It won't be until later that the scholars, that sort of nativist scholars really create an independent Shinto. So it is those Mito domain scholars, and then from them into the 1700s you get the Kokugaku scholars, which are nativist scholars. These are samurai scholars who want to, in their mind, restore a religion. But the problem is there isn't a religion there for them to restore, so they have to go to work disempowering Yoshida Shinto, banning certain books that they don't know how to factor into their project, and then they have to do a massive undertaking of cherry picking a whole bunch of things in order to build what is basically a new religion. Now they're selling it that they're restoring Shinto, but really they're building something new. They're actually creating something new from ancient parts, because simply put, if Shinto truly existed as an independent religion prior to their efforts, they wouldn't have had to work so hard and do so many mental and scholarly gymnastics in order to save it. When you read their works, when you look at their works, when you see all the things that they did in order to quote-unquote save Shinto, it's very clear that they are building a religion from old parts. And this, of course, leads us to the great irony, and that is that Shinto, quote-unquote Shinto, as built by the 1700s nativist scholars, would never have existed if Buddhism hadn't taken in the Taoistified amalgamation of rituals and beliefs. because Buddhism took in those beliefs, incorporated those beliefs, developed them and grew them, only because of that were the nativist scholars of the 1700s able to build a quote-unquote Shinto by cherry-picking bits and pieces out of that amorphous amalgamation and form what they called a restored Shinto. And this is one of the key reasons why we say that Shinto is, ironically, really, Shinto is an offshoot of Buddhism. Furthermore, when we look at the documents like the Tada Genji documents and the Hachiman Daibusatsu records, etc., they clearly show a belief that Buddhism is the religion and that there is a collection, an amorphous collection of matters pertaining to local gods, the worldly extension of Buddhism. And Buddhism does this. In every country Buddhism goes to, it absorbs the amorphous local customs, and they become a part of Buddhism that's called like the worldly extension of Buddhism, or the worldly affairs part. So it's not Dharma, it's not part of the Buddha's Dharma, but it is contained under the umbrella of the Buddhism. So these are not independent religions, they're just like I've been saying, an amorphous amalgamation of local customs that get brought under the banner of Buddhism in that country. And that's what you see in the records, and that's what you see in the beliefs displayed in the records. This modern day concept of Buddhism and Shinto, it's really a modern day concept. And of course it becomes a concept, it starts to become a concept with Issei Shinto, Yoshida Shinto. They start to develop that crack. And then the nativist scholars of the 1700s are really the first time somebody really tried to say Buddhism and Shinto as two distinct entities. Even the shrines, people say, well, again, one of the biggest things people like to do is they say, well, aren't there Shinto shrines? But you got to remember, prior to the Meiji Restoration, a Shinto shrine is just a local holy site related to a family or a particular local deity, and it's run by priest or shamans or priestess or oracles or whatever, whoever's running it. It's usually run by a local family. But those shrines are oftentimes they also house Buddha statues and oftentimes house monks. So they're, you know what I mean? So the shrine is not anything independent. That idea, that hardline idea that Shinto is here and Buddhism is there, that's just something you just simply do not see until the nativist scholars of the 1700s build a religion from scrap parts and then claim that they've restored a religion. They didn't restore a religion. They built a new religion. And like I said earlier, you can see the split beginning in Issei style and in Yoshida style. But even those two styles can't really split them from Buddhism. That separation of Buddhism really only appears when the nativist scholars of the 1700s are constructing this new thing they're calling Shinto, cherry-picking it from pieces of the past, and then they're pushing Buddhism as far away from it as they can because, again, they're nativist. They're trying to create a purely Japanese religion. But that thing, it just doesn't exist prior to their to their creation. It's just not there. And to be honest, the split doesn't really complete itself until the Meiji Restoration. And as most of the viewers know, this is when the government finally identifies Shinto as a truly, fully independent religion, and it becomes a state religion, and they force a complete split from Buddhism. It is then and only then does Shinto truly exist in the world as an independent religion. Think about that. Meiji Restoration. This is the first time Shinto exists as an independent religion, truly. So in the beginning, you have Taoism and political rituals, family political rituals, an amorphous collection of them. And that's brought into Buddhism. There is no independent Shinto at this time. So as a part of Buddhism, underneath the banner of Buddhism, this amorphous collection grows and develops over hundreds of years until finally in the 1700s scholars begin to conceive of some kind of generic mental concept of a independent Shinto. So then they get to work on creating an independent Shinto, building something new, not restoring anything, building something new. This nativist concept of Shinto as an independent religion then grows until the Meiji Restoration, which ironically the Tokugawa government supported the nativist, and then ironically it's because the nativists built this new Shinto religion that then ultimately helped lead to the Meiji Restoration kicking the Tokugawa out. So it's a little bit ironic. So this built until the Meiji Restoration, and then as we know, the Meiji then took the stance of Shinto is an independent religion, it is the state religion, split it from Buddhism, Buddhism goes over there. That, again, the first time in history that happens is the Meiji Restoration. But because of the Meiji's stance on the issue, most Japanese, and foreigners of course, believe and have a view that Shinto has always been its own independent, self-characterized religion. This is what most Japanese believe, this is what most foreigners believe, and this is what almost all the books will say, etc., etc., etc. This is one of those things where, yeah, quote unquote, everyone knows this. But the reality, the actuality is that there never was a Shinto prior to Buddhism. There was only these amorphous collection of Taoist-based political rituals, or political rituals, clan rituals, but they are Taoist. Yes, there's a little bit of native Japanese in there because it's Japanese families, but it is for the most part Taoist, Chinese-based rituals, and it's an amorphous cloud. There's no cohesive collection to it, and this amorphous collection was took in by Buddhism as part of Buddhism, and it grew and developed as a part of Buddhism for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, until eventually a group of nativists wanted to build the idea of an independent religion, so they built Shinto in the 1700s from pieces that they selected, and then discarded the Buddhism. Then this was finalized when the Meiji Restoration came out and said it's the independent religion, state religion, and Buddhism, and is now sort of evicted from the dynamic. So of course, for simplicity's sake, when we say Shinto, we say Shinto for simplicity's sake. And it gets discussed in our present day and age as if it was its own independent religion, because again, there's two opinions: the opinion that it is its own independent religion, and then the opinion that it is not its own independent religion, but that it is a subset of Buddhism, sort of born from a collection of local rituals and Taoism pre-existing in Japan, etc., etc., etc. So which one you choose to believe is up to you. I'm not trying to tell you which one is correct or which one is false, but what I will tell you is that there are two opinions, and that while the current state of Japan identifies the first opinion as the correct opinion, it has not always been that way. There's been a huge chunk of history where the second opinion was the official opinion of the country. Furthermore, the key point of this video is to explain to you that the Tada Genji tradition believes the second opinion, that Shinto is not its own independent entity. There is only one author in the Tada Genji tradition history, which would be Tada Yoshitoshi. He was a nativist in the 1700s. He writes about Tada Genji traditions, but he's really specifically, because he's a nativist, he only records the aspects that align with his nativist view of Shinto. And because of that, his work is heavy, heavy, heavy on the quote-unquote Shinto, and it doesn't have any of the Buddhism. He is the only Tada Genji author within the context that does that. So 99% of the rest of the Tada Genji tradition believes opinion 2, that Shinto is not its own independent entity, but that is just a sort of generic amorphous collection that falls under the banner of Buddhism. So needless to say, of course, that second view is highly controversial in the modern age because of the simple fact that the current government supports first opinion. But again, like I said, it would not have all been controversial back in the days of Genji Mitsunaka and Genji Yorimitsu. Genji Mitsunaka and Genji Yorimitsu believed that Buddhism was the root religion and that the thing that we now call Shinto was just an amorphous amalgamation of rites and rituals under the banner of Buddhism. That's what they believed. So, like I said though, but because the current idea of Shinto is so burned into the Japanese mindset from the Meiji government onward, simply explaining the history of Japan, the history of the religion in Japan, starting from the beginning and moving forward, it unfortunately becomes controversial. So it's weird because what is normally considered good historical approach becomes controversial. It's like the world's been turned upside down. And ironically, if we look from the perspective of the Southern Court would say, well, because the Meiji government is not the correct emperor, the world is turned upside down. Ironically, it's kind of what we see going on. When we do history the correct way, we start from the beginning and we work forward, we actually find ourselves being controversial against a viewpoint which is actually retrospective. So yeah, anyway, it's kind of interesting. But so that's the end of the video. Controversial topic. We took a long time talking about it and we did barely even scratch the surface. But hopefully you've watched the whole video and you've understood it. And so as we move forward, you can get a better idea of what the Genji tradition is actually saying.